The sound woke me. Not the steady tick of the old clock in the hall or the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. It was the sharp, metallic ping of my phone, that little bell that usually meant a grocery coupon or Emma sending me one of her late-night essays to proofread. But tonight, it wasn't Emma. I squinted at the screen. The glow hurt my eyes, but the words were clear enough, black letters on a white background that seemed to shout at me. Balance $0,000. For a moment I thought it was a mistake, some glitch in the bank system, a misplaced decimal. But then I saw the line below stamped in bold, 529 college savings plan withdrawal completed. And that was when my chest went cold. Tomorrow, no, technically today because the clock read 12:47 a.m., was the deadline to pay Emma's tuition deposit. 18 years I'd been building that fund. 18 years of skipped vacations, of working Saturdays I could have spent fishing, of buying the cheap cuts of meat and telling myself they tasted just as good. 18 years of saying, someday this will send her to college. Someday this will open doors we never had. And now, $0. I sat there in the glow of the phone, the silence pressing heavy against my ears. My first thought was Emma. Her smile the day the acceptance letter came, the way she'd pressed the paper to her chest like it was a ticket to another universe. "Grandpa," she'd whispered, "I got in." And I had whispered back, "Of course you did." Now what was I supposed to tell her? That her dream cost too much, that her father's carelessness, or worse, had slammed the door I'd been holding open all these years. I pushed myself up, joints aching the way they do when you've spent a lifetime on your knees, laying tile, fixing pipes, crawling under sinks. The house creaked around me. My wife used to call those sounds the home breathing. But tonight, every creak felt like an accusation. I shuffled to the kitchen, poured a glass of water I didn't want, and stared at the reflection of the man in the window. A man with white hair, lined eyes, a weary slump to his shoulders. A man who had promised his granddaughter that money would never stand in her way. And here he was, staring back at me, empty-handed. I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe there had been an error. Yes, that had to be it. I opened the banking app, thumb trembling as I typed in my password. The screen loaded slowly, each spinning wheel a small torment. Finally, the numbers appeared. Not numbers, number, 0. The transaction history showed it clearly. A single massive withdrawal, authorized electronically 2 days ago. I read the memo line twice just to be sure. Family expense reimbursement. Family expense. The words tasted like rust in my mouth. I knew then what had happened. My son, Mike, the only other person with access, the boy I once carried on my shoulders at county fairs, the man who just last week told me he was short on cash but insisted everything was fine. I saw it now. The trip he'd been hinting at. The anniversary getaway he'd promised his wife. The champagne photos they'd been posting online, the hotel balconies, the sunsets that looked stolen from a postcard. All of it paid for with Emma's future. I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles burned white. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a bank statement in the middle of the night. I thought back to when I first opened that account. Emma was barely out of diapers. Mike had laughed, said, "Dad, she's 2 years old, she doesn't need college money yet." But I'd shaken my head. You'll see, time moves fast. One day we'll blink and she'll be packing her bags. And now she was packing, but the bags might never leave this house. I closed my eyes and saw my wife again, her hand on my arm the night we signed the papers. "You're doing the right thing," she'd whispered. "She'll remember this gift for the rest of her life." I wanted to believe she was right, but at that moment, staring at the ugly 0 on my phone, I felt only failure. I walked back to the living room, sat in my recliner, the one with the worn arms and the faint smell of her perfume still clinging to the fabric. The grandfather clock struck 1, each chime echoing like a hammer in the dark. I should have been asleep dreaming of better days. Instead, I was wide awake with the heavy knowledge that my own son had robbed not just me but his daughter, and tomorrow Emma would wake up expecting hope. What would I give her? A smile painted over despair. A story about bank errors and waiting on hold. No, she deserved the truth, but not yet. First, I needed to understand how deep this betrayal ran. The phone lay heavy in my hand. I thought of calling Mike, demanding answers, but I already knew the answers. So instead, I opened a blank page in the Notepad app, and I began to write, not a letter of anger, not yet, but notes, dates, numbers, every detail of the theft, because one thing was certain. I might be old, I might be tired, but I was not finished. And I would not let my granddaughter's future be stolen in the night, not while I was still breathing. The first ring startled me. The second ring filled the empty room like an echo of my own heartbeat. By the third, I was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. And then came the fourth, the fifth, voicemail. "Hi, this is Mike, leave a message." I ended the call before the beep. For a moment I just sat there staring at the blank screen. My thumb hovered, tempted to try again. But the house was too quiet, too still, and the thought of hearing that cheerful recorded voice one more time felt unbearable. I knew where he was. Not in bed, not at work, not pacing the kitchen wondering how to pay the bills. No, he was somewhere warm, somewhere with a view of turquoise water and a glass of champagne in his hand. And the money that was supposed to carry his daughter into a better future was instead paying for a king-sized bed in a resort he could never have afforded. I lowered the phone into my lap and tried to steady my breathing. The silence pressed in again, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rattle of the wind against the windows. It was the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from absence. I thought about Emma, asleep in her room across town, maybe dreaming about dorm rooms and lecture halls and new friends she hadn't even met yet. And here I was, her grandfather, pacing my living room in the middle of the night, wrestling with the truth that her father, my own son, had cut the legs out from under her. I tried to remember the last time Mike had answered a call on the first ring. It used to be always. When he was young, the phone would buzz and he'd shout, "Dad, I got it." He couldn't wait to pick up, to connect, to hear the world on the other side. But somewhere along the way, his phone had stopped being a lifeline. It had become a shield, something he hid behind, silencing calls, letting messages pile up, choosing what truths he wanted to hear. Tonight, my truth wasn't one of them. I pressed redial. One ring, two, three, voicemail again. "Mike," I whispered into the quiet, "what have you done?" The clock on the wall clicked over to 1:30 a.m. My body ached for sleep, but my mind was a restless storm. I thought of all the conversations we'd had over the years about money. The time he came to me, hat in hand, asking for a loan to cover a car repair. The months when I let him and his wife live in this very house after he lost a job, never charging rent, never asking for anything but respect. I had told myself it was temporary, that he would find his footing, that he just needed a little more time. But time, I was realizing, was the one thing I'd already given him in abundance. I rose from the chair and paced the living room, my hand trailing along the back of the old sofa, the one Emma used to curl up on with a book. The fabric felt rough under my fingertips, like the years themselves had worn it down. I thought of how easily trust could be worn down the same way. One favor, one broken promise, one withdrawal too many, until one night you looked at your own son's name on the phone screen and felt more suspicion than love. I tried once more. This time the call went straight to voicemail without ringing at all. He'd silenced it, or turned it off, and in that small, deliberate act he told me more than words ever could. I set the phone down on the table beside me. The glow from the screen faded, leaving me in darkness again. There are moments when silence is louder than shouting, moments when the absence of an answer is the answer itself. I understood then that Mike wasn't going to pick up. Not tonight. Not while he was still clinking glasses and toasting anniversaries with stolen money. My wife used to tell me that a father never stops hoping. "You can be furious," she'd say, "but you'll still wait for the phone to ring." Maybe she was right. Maybe part of me would always wait. But as the night stretched on, as the house seemed to sink deeper into the kind of quiet that presses on your chest, I realized hope wasn't enough anymore. Hope wouldn't refill Emma's account. Hope wouldn't pay her tuition. Hope wouldn't undo the betrayal of a son who had chosen himself over his own child. The phone lay dark on the table, but in my mind it rang and rang. Each unanswered call was a chisel, carving a truth I didn't want to face. I wasn't just the grandfather trying to protect his granddaughter. I was also the father, coming to terms with the fact that his own son had crossed a line. And once that line is crossed, you can't step back over it. Not without leaving footprints, not without scars. The night stretched past 2. The street outside was empty, the houses dark, the world asleep. But I sat awake in my chair, staring at the silent phone, knowing sleep would not come easily again. I had called and he had not answered. And in that silence, a promise began to form inside me. If Mike would not protect his daughter's future, then I would, even if it meant protecting her from him. Morning came slow, as if even the sun hesitated to rise on a day like this. I hadn't slept more than an hour. When I finally opened the curtains, the light that spilled and didn't feel warm, it felt sharp, like it was cutting into the quiet ache of the night before. The phone was still on the table where I'd left it. No missed calls, no text from Mike, nothing. But there was a message waiting for me, tucked into the rhythm of my morning. Not digital, not flashing on a screen. It was a knock at my door, soft, polite, almost musical. I opened it to find Emma standing there, a bundle of papers in her arms, her face lit up in that way only 18-year-olds can manage, as if the whole world is just beginning and nothing can possibly stop it. "Grandpa," she said, almost breathless, "I brought my acceptance packet. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes carried that same shade of blue her grandmother once had. She stepped inside, dropped her backpack by the door, and spread the papers across the kitchen table like a dealer laying out cards. "There's the course catalog," she said, tapping one sheet with her finger. "And this is the housing brochure. They've got these dorms with study lounges, look, right here." She pointed to a photo of smiling students gathered around laptops, coffee cups in hand. Her own smile was brighter than all of them combined. I stood there, leaning on the counter, letting her words pour over me. Her excitement was pure, unfiltered, the kind of joy that makes you forget for a moment about bank statements and betrayal. She looked up suddenly, catching my eye. "You're proud of me, right?" The question was so simple, but it pierced me. Because the truth was, I wasn't just proud, I was terrified. Terrified that the future she saw stretched out before her might collapse before she ever set foot on that campus. "Of course I'm proud," I said softly, forcing steadiness into my voice. "You've worked for this, Emma. You've earned every bit of it." Her face glowed at the words, and she turned back to the papers. She spoke about classes she wanted to take, psychology, literature, maybe even a minor in art history. She spoke about independence, about making her own meals in the dorm kitchenette, about late-night study sessions with friends she hadn't met yet. Each word built a picture in my mind, a life she was already stepping into. And with each word, the weight inside me grew heavier, because I knew what she didn't. I knew the account her father had drained. I knew the deposit deadline that ticked closer by the hour. I wanted to tell her. The words were right there, pressing against my chest, begging to be let out. But as I looked at her with all that hope shining in her eyes, I couldn't do it. Not yet. Not until I had something more than despair to offer. She slid a form across the table. "This one's about meal plans. Do you think I should do the 20 a week option, or is that too much?" I picked up the paper, squinting at the tiny print, pretending to study it while really studying her. Her handwriting in the margins, little notes and stars. Her whole future was written in those small marks. "I think," I said carefully, "that whichever one you choose, you'll make it work. You've always had that in you." She grinned, satisfied, and scribbled something in the corner. As she talked, I drifted back for a moment, remembering a very different table. The one where she sat as a child, crayons scattered around, drawing crooked houses and stick figures. She used to slide her pictures over to me with the same eagerness, saying, "Grandpa, look what I made." Back then, I'd taped them to the refrigerator, proud as if they belonged in a museum. And now here she was, sliding over brochures and forms instead, painting a future not with crayons but with ambition. And just like then, I wanted nothing more than to hang it up proudly and say, "Look what she made." She must have noticed the quiet in me, because she stopped mid-sentence and tilted her head. "You okay, Grandpa? You seem tired." I forced a small smile. "Didn't sleep much. Old bones, you know." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her touch was warm, grounding, the way her grandmother's had been in my hardest days. "You've always been there for me," she said softly. "I know college is expensive. I want you to know, if it's too much, I can apply for more scholarships. I don't want to be a burden." That word, burden, it sliced through me like a blade. Because the truth was, she wasn't a burden. She was the reason. The reason I'd saved, the reason I'd sacrificed. The reason I'd opened that account 18 years ago and guarded it like a treasure chest. I swallowed hard, blinked back the sting in my eyes, and shook my head. "You're not a burden, Emma. Not now, not ever. Don't you forget that." She smiled, a little uncertain, but let it go. Gathering up her papers, she slid them back into her folder, tucking her dream neatly away. "I'll let you rest," she said, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Just wanted to share all this with you. It feels more real when I show you." At the door she turned, her face glowing once more. "Grandpa, I'm going to make you proud." And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving the house quiet again. I stood there in the silence, staring at the empty table. Her dream had filled the room moments ago. Now it lingered in the air like perfume, sweet and fragile, and I knew with a certainty that left no room for hesitation that I would do whatever it took to keep that dream alive, even if it meant standing against my own son. After Emma left, the house settled into the kind of stillness that presses on a man's chest. Her laughter had barely faded from the walls, but already the silence rushed in to take its place. I sat down at the table where her papers had been spread, tracing the faint marks her pen had left in the wood. 18 years ago, this same table had been covered with very different papers, pay stubs, overdue bills, and a calculator that never seemed to land on the right number. It was there, in those long nights, that the college fund was born. Back then, it was just an idea, a dream whispered between me and her grandmother after Emma's first birthday. We had watched her toddle across the living room, chubby hands outstretched, and my wife had said, "She'll need more than we ever had." I remember nodding, my chest swelling with both love and worry. We had scraped by for most of our lives. There was never much left over, but the thought of Emma facing the same uphill climb, that was something I couldn't bear. So I started small, $50 a month, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the jobs I could find. At first it didn't look like much, just a few numbers on a statement, but each dollar carried the weight of a choice. I remember the summer I turned down a fishing trip with my buddies. They had rented a cabin up north, promised me the best walleye season in years. I told them I couldn't swing it. What I didn't tell them was that the money I saved went straight into the account with Emma's name on it. I remember the Christmas I gave my wife a handmade frame instead of the necklace she'd once admired. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and slipped our granddaughter's photo inside. She never mentioned the necklace again, but I knew she understood where the money had gone. And there were the meals, more than I can count, where I spooned just a little less onto my plate, stretching groceries so I wouldn't have to touch the fund. It wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was downright exhausting. I worked double shifts, came home with my back screaming, my hands raw from concrete and dust. There were nights when I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my boots, wondering if I was a fool for believing a handful of dollars could one day open the doors of a university. But then I'd hear Emma's laugh from down the hall, or see the way her grandmother tucked her in with such care, and I knew it wasn't foolishness, it was faith. When Emma was 7, Mike lost his job for the first time. He came to me embarrassed, asking if they could stay just a few months. I let them move into the house, paid the utilities, bought extra groceries. I didn't touch the fund. I told myself that money is not mine, not his, not even ours. It belongs to her. And so it sat there, growing slowly like a sapling that one day might be strong enough to shelter her. There were temptations, of course. Car repairs that would have been easier if I dipped into it. Medical bills that could have been smoothed over. But each time I looked at that statement and thought of her future. I remember one winter, the furnace went out. The repairman quoted me a price that made my stomach twist. I stared at the fund statement on the counter for nearly an hour. But in the end, I bundled myself in extra blankets, used a space heater, and waited until spring to fix it properly. The account remained untouched. Not long after, my wife grew sick. Hospital visits, medications, the long nights of worry. We had insurance, but there are always gaps, always something that slips through the cracks. I sat by her bed once, bills spread around me, and she reached for my hand. "Don't you dare touch that money," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were fierce. "That's for Emma, promise me." I promised, and when she passed, that promise became sacred. The fund grew slowly, steadily, like a second heartbeat in the house. Every time I got a raise, I bumped up the deposit. Every tax return, I funneled a portion into it. It wasn't just money, it was sacrifice poured into numbers, a record of every choice we made to put her first. And now, to think of it gone in a single swipe of a card for cocktails and palm trees, it made my stomach churn. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. The nights of work, the dinners skipped, the vacations never taken. The way my wife had squeezed my hand, making me swear, all of it had been for Emma, not for Mike, not for me, for her. And no matter what had happened to that account, no matter what betrayal had drained it, that truth remained. The sacrifices weren't wasted, because they had shaped me into the man who would not, could not, let her dream be stolen. The next morning, I drove into town. The sky was gray, low clouds pressing down like a lid, the kind that makes you feel smaller than you already do. The roads were quiet, the way they often are after a night of rain, and each stoplight seemed to hold me a little longer than usual, as if delaying what I already knew I had to face. The bank sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, same brick building it had always been, with its proud columns and flag that whipped in the breeze. I'd walked through those doors hundreds of times over the years, deposit slips in hand, a nod for the tellers who knew me by name. But today, as the glass door slid open, I felt like I was walking into a courtroom. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of coffee. A young woman at the reception desk smiled brightly, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who hasn't yet learned how heavy money can feel. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" "I need to speak with someone about my granddaughter's college fund," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "It's urgent." She typed something into her computer, nodded, and motioned for me to take a seat. The chairs were too soft, the kind that swallows you when you sit down. I perched on the edge, gripping my hat in both hands. A man in a navy suit appeared a few minutes later. He was tall, with neat hair and glasses that caught the light. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Daniel. Why don't you come back to my office?" His office was small but tidy, a framed diploma on the wall and a photo of 2 kids on his desk. He offered me coffee, which I declined, and then sat across from me with the patience of someone who had delivered bad news before. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. I slid the folded statement across the desk, the one that had stolen my sleep. "The account, it's empty. I need to know how and who." He opened the file on his computer, tapping at the keys with quiet efficiency. The screen's glow reflected in his glasses, hiding his eyes. "Ah, yes, I see the withdrawal here. Significant amount. Let me check the authorization details." The room seemed to shrink as I waited, the sound of the keyboard filling the silence. Finally, he leaned back, folding his hands. "It was withdrawn electronically by an authorized account manager." My throat tightened. "Which manager?" He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Michael Hayes, your son." The words landed like a hammer. I had known, of course. I'd felt it in my bones since the moment I saw the zero, but hearing it spoken aloud, formal and factual, made it real in a way I hadn't been ready for. "Are you sure?" I asked, though the question was more a whisper than a challenge. "Quite sure," Daniel said gently. "There's a digital signature on file, matching the authorization we received years ago. He has co-manager status on the account." I closed my eyes for a moment, of course. I remembered signing those forms back when Emma was still in grade school. Mike had insisted it made sense, in case something happens to you, Dad, and I, foolishly trusting, had agreed. "Is there any way to reverse it?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not unless it was unauthorized, but in this case he had full rights. Legally, the withdrawal stands." The words settled heavy in the air, final and unyielding. I felt something deep in me sag, like a beam giving way under too much weight. I looked at the photo on his desk, his children smiling in the sunlight. "Do they know," I asked softly, "what you'd give up for them?" He blinked, caught off guard. "I suppose they don't, not yet." I nodded slowly. "Then hold on to them, don't ever let them forget it." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable, and shifted back to business. "There is one thing, Mr. Hayes. The account history shows a memo attached to the transaction. Would you like to hear it?" I nodded. He read from the screen. "Family expense reimbursement, vacation." My stomach twisted. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. Not medical bills, not debt collectors, just vacation. I rose slowly, hat in hand. "Thank you for your time," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Daniel stood as well, offering a sympathetic smile. "If there's anything else we can do, please don't hesitate." But there wasn't, not here, not within these walls of numbers and signatures. The battle I had to fight was no longer about banks or balances. It was about blood and betrayal. Outside, the sky had darkened, a storm rolling in from the west. The flag out front whipped harder now, its edges fraying in the wind. I stood on the steps for a long moment, staring at the gray horizon, letting the truth settle into my bones. My son had stolen from his own daughter, and in doing so he had stolen from me, from the promise I had made to his mother, from the years of sacrifice I had poured into that account. The bank had given me facts, but facts were only the beginning. What I carried home with me that day was not just knowledge. It was resolve. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me. The same table where Emma had spread her brochures just a day earlier. Now it held nothing but the dim glow of the screen and a bitterness I couldn't swallow. I typed Mike's name into the search bar, my fingers stiff on the keys. It didn't take long. Social media has a way of showing us what we wish we hadn't seen. And there it was, photo after photo. A world of blue skies and white sand, framed by palm trees that bent as if in greeting. The kind of place travel magazines sell with words like paradise and escape. Mike stood in the center of it, a drink in his hand, his arm wrapped around his wife. Both of them grinning, golden in the sunlight, their smiles wide enough to suggest that all the world's troubles had been left far behind. But their troubles hadn't vanished. They were sitting in my empty account. I clicked through the pictures one by one. Dinner plates stacked high with lobster tails and shrimp cocktail. A balcony view of the ocean, the horizon lit in pinks and golds. Her in a new dress, him in a linen shirt he'd never have worn at home. And always the hashtags, #blessed, #anniversary trip, #living our best life. Each one felt like a slap. I thought of Emma at her desk, hunched over scholarship forms, worried she might not be enough. I thought of myself counting out bills at the grocery store, choosing generic brands so I could put away a little more each month. And here was my son, burning it all on sunsets and cocktails with umbrellas in them. The comments were worse. Friends writing, "You deserve this." Old acquaintances chiming in, "So happy for you both." And Mike himself replying with a string of laughing emojis as though he were in on some grand cosmic joke. But the only joke was on us, on his daughter who had worked her heart out for a dream he just cashed in, on me who had spent half a lifetime building something he could dismantle in a single transaction. I zoomed in on one picture, a close-up of their dinner table by the beach. A candle flickered in the center, caught mid-glow, reflecting in the glass of wine they held aloft. I stared at his hand. The same hand that once reached for mine when he was a boy, sticky with melted ice cream, clutching me as if I was the only safe place in the world. Now that hand was wrapped around a glass paid for by Betrayal. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under the weight of me. Anger burned hot in my chest, but underneath it was something colder, disappointment, a hollow ache that no outburst could fill. I had raised him better, at least I thought I had. I had shown him sacrifice, shown him what it meant to put family first, and still he had chosen this. The photos kept scrolling, parasailing over turquoise water, couples massages in a spa lined with bamboo, a yacht rental, their smiles wide against the backdrop of white sails. Each image carried a price tag, though none of them were listed. I could calculate them in my mind the way I used to estimate the cost of lumber or drywall. Every dollar I saw was one I had meant for Emma. Every laugh was balanced against her worry. And then I saw the video. His wife had posted it, 30 seconds of them dancing barefoot in the sand, the waves lapping at their ankles. She spun, laughing, her earrings catching the last light of the sunset. Mike pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and someone off camera cheered. I closed the laptop. The sound was too much. It wasn't joy to me. It was theft dressed up as romance. I sat in the dim kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about the balance of love and anger. How a man can love his son and despise his choices in the same breath. How the same boy you once lifted onto your shoulders could grow into a man who would rob you blind with a smile. And still a part of me longed for him to pick up the phone, to explain, to say there had been some mistake. But the pictures told the truth. There was no mistake. There was only Mike laughing in the sun, while Emma's dream trembled in the shadows. I poured myself a glass of water, though it tasted bitter in my mouth, and stared at the window. Rain had begun to fall outside, soft at first, then steady. The drops streaked the glass, blurring the world beyond. It struck me then how easily something can be washed away. Money, trust, years of sacrifice, all gone in a flash, leaving only the question of what would be built in their place. I didn't have the answer yet, But I knew this much. Emma's future wasn't going to drown in the waves of her father's vacation. Not while I still had breath to fight for her. The rain hadn't stopped by the time night came. It drummed against the roof steady and hard, the kind of rain that feels like it wants to wash a man clean, whether he wants it or not. I sat by the phone for a long time, staring at it, letting the sound of the storm fill the silence in my chest. All day I'd carried the weight of those photographs, my son's laughter, his wife's new dress, the wine glasses held aloft while my granddaughter's account sat empty. At some point, the weight shifts. It stops being shock, stops being sorrow. It hardens into something else, resolve. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. By the 4th, I was ready for it to go to voicemail again. But this time I heard his voice, live and unguarded. "Dad." There was noise in the background, muffled music, people talking, glasses clinking, the soundtrack of his vacation. "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "It's me." He hesitated. "You're calling late, everything okay?" I could almost picture his face, the half smile he wore when he thought he was being clever. The same smile he used as a boy when he'd been caught sneaking cookies before dinner. But this wasn't cookies, and I wasn't smiling. "Not everything," I said. "I got a statement from the bank." The line went quiet for a beat, the kind of pause that says more than words. "I don't know what you mean," he finally said. His voice carried an edge of caution. "Don't play games with me, Mike. I saw the withdrawal, every cent of Emma's fund, gone." Another pause, longer this time, then a sigh, heavy and impatient. "Dad, look, it was just sitting there. You act like it was some sacred treasure chest. We needed it. We've been under a lot of pressure. You wouldn't understand." My hand tightened on the receiver. "Wouldn't understand. I built that fund from nothing. I worked nights, weekends, holidays. Every dollar was a piece of me meant for your daughter." His tone sharpened, defensive. "Don't guilt me, Dad. It's not like she won't have other options. Scholarships, loans, kids, figure it out. But your daughter-in-law and we needed a break. We've been stretched thin. You have no idea what that does to a marriage." The words stung in their selfishness. I thought of his mother, lying in a hospital bed, whispering for me not to touch the fund. I thought of Emma's hopeful eyes as she showed me her acceptance packet. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked quietly. "You chose lobster and hotel balconies over your daughter's future. You chose palm trees over her college classroom. How do you live with that?" His voice rose, irritation replacing the veneer of calm. "Don't act holier than thou. You've always had this martyr complex. You think you're the only one who sacrifices. I'm trying to keep my family together." I let the words hang for a moment, the storm outside pounding harder like it too wanted an answer. "Your family," I said slowly, "isn't the woman sipping cocktails beside you. It's the girl who carries your last name and wonders if she'll ever afford to walk into her first lecture hall. That's your family." There was silence on his end, the kind that made me wonder if he'd hung up. Then, softer, almost muttered, "You always cared more about her than me." The words caught me off guard, old wounds bleeding through new betrayal. I closed my eyes, remembering him as a boy, running ahead at the park, always glancing back to see if I was watching. I had been, always. "I cared about both of you," I said, voice breaking despite myself. "But somewhere along the way you forgot what it means to care for someone else." The music in the background swelled for a moment, then faded as if he had stepped outside. His voice returned, colder now. "Look, Dad, the money's gone, it's done. You can lecture me all you want, but it won't change that. Maybe it's time you let go." "Let go," that was his answer. I gripped the phone tighter. "Mike," I said, my words steady now, each one heavy with promise. "I'll never let go of Emma's future. Not for you, not for anyone. If you think this ends here, you're wrong." There was a rustle, a sharp exhale, and then the line went dead. He'd hung up. I set the receiver down gently, my hand trembling, not from weakness but from the storm inside me. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows as if the whole sky had joined the argument. In the quiet that followed, I sat back, breathing hard, staring into the dark room. For the first time since the zero appeared on that bank statement, I no longer felt helpless. My son had spoken his truth, and I had spoken mine. Now it was time to act. The storm finally broke near dawn. The house smelled faintly of wet earth through the cracked window, the kind of scent that carries both endings and beginnings. I hadn't slept, not after that call. His voice still echoed in my head, sharp, defensive, hollow with excuses. I moved through the house slowly, almost without thinking, until I found myself in the room I'd avoided most. the bedroom where my wife had spent her final months. The door creaked open, and there it was, just as it had been. Her nightstand, the lamp with its soft beige shade, the small jewelry box that still held a pair of earrings she never wore after the chemo began. The air was still, as though the room had been holding its breath all this time. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress giving under my weight, and let myself drift back. Those last weeks were quiet. She never wanted the machines, never wanted the sterile brightness of a hospital. She wanted this room, the quilt she had sewn herself, the sound of the wind in the trees, the rhythm of our home. Some nights, I'd read aloud to her, even when her eyes closed before I finished the first page. Other nights, we'd just lie there, hands clasped, her thumb brushing mine with what strength she had left. And then there were the nights when she spoke truths she had held too long, truths she wanted to leave behind like gifts. "Promise me something," she said once, her voice so faint I had to lean close. Her breath smelled faintly of peppermint tea, her favorite. "Anything," I whispered. "Promise me you won't let them take advantage of you. You give and give, Roy, and they take, sometimes without even realizing how much. Don't let them take what belongs to Emma." Her eyes, clouded but fierce, locked on mine. "You've spent your whole life building for her future. That's your legacy. Protect it." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I promise," I told her, and she smiled, small but real. "That's enough for me." There were other nights, too, nights when she spoke about Mike. "He was always restless," she murmured once. "Always wanted more than he had. I used to think that meant ambition, but sometimes I wonder if it just means emptiness." She turned her head toward me, her hand trembling as she gripped mine tighter. "Don't mistake his charm for gratitude. He loves in bursts, Roy, but Emma, she loves steady. Build with her, not for him." Her words come back to me now, sharper than ever. At the time, I thought they were just the worries of a mother trying to hold on to her family as she slipped away. But she had seen something I hadn't. She had seen the cracks in him long before they widened into betrayal. And she had seen the strength in Emma, the kind that doesn't come from money or ease but from resilience. The memory carried me to her final night. The rain had been falling then too, steady against the window, a quiet hymn. She had turned her head, eyes half closed, and whispered words that etched themselves into me like stone. "Don't let her feel alone, Roy. Not Emma. Not ever. If I can't be here, you have to be enough for both of us." Her hand had been light in mine, bones and skin, and something already slipping beyond this world. "I will," I whispered. And she had smiled, that same smile she'd worn when she first placed Emma in my arms 18 years earlier. Moments later, she was gone. Sitting there now, in the dim light of morning, I felt her presence as strongly as I ever had. The jewelry box, the lamp, the faint smell of lavender on the quilt. It was all reminder and instruction. I had promised her, not just once but many times, in the language of vows and in the silence of shared looks. And now my son's betrayal had pulled that promise back into the light. I rose from the bed and crossed to the dresser. Her photo stood there, framed in silver, her smile frozen in time. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the cool metal. "You were right," I said aloud, voice breaking in the empty room. "You always were. He's restless, he's careless, and he's taken what doesn't belong to him." I set the frame back down, careful, reverent. "But I won't let him take her dream. I swear to you I won't." Outside, the rain slowed, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves. A weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, spilling across the quilt, warm and fragile. I stood there, letting it fall across me, feeling for the first time in days that maybe I wasn't alone in this fight. Her voice lingered in me, not as a whisper now, but as something stronger. A command, a compass. And I knew where it was pointing. Toward Emma, toward the future, toward keeping a promise that mattered more than any storm. The morning after visiting her room, I found myself back at the kitchen table. The rain had cleared, leaving the world washed and bright. But inside me the storm had only shifted shape. Grief had hardened into something sharper, purpose. I pulled out a drawer where I kept old files, papers stacked in neat piles like layers of my life, receipts, tax forms, dog-eared utility bills. And tucked between them an envelope marked in my handwriting, "Emma Future." I slid it out and opened it, the paper inside crisp despite the years. Account numbers, a balance summary. Not the account Mike had emptied, but another. One he didn't know about. It had been my wife's idea years ago, back when Emma was still in middle school. We were sitting on the porch one evening, the cicadas loud in the trees, when she leaned over and whispered, You trust too easily, Roy, even with him." She didn't have to say who. We both knew. Mike had already borrowed money twice that year, both times swearing it was temporary. "I just think," she continued, her hand resting on mine, "you ought to have something put aside, something no one can touch but you." At first I resisted. It felt deceitful, keeping something hidden. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw the wisdom in her words. So one Saturday I walked into the bank and opened a second 529 plan. Quietly, without fanfare. Just my name on the papers, no co-managers, no loopholes. I funneled smaller amounts into it here and there whenever I could. Birthday checks from relatives, tax refunds, cash from weekend repair jobs I picked up for neighbors. It grew slowly like a secret garden, not as large as the main fund but enough to matter, enough to be the safety net my wife had imagined. Now, all these years later, I unfolded the summary and read the numbers. They weren't dazzling, not compared to what had been lost, but they were strong, strong enough to cover Emma's first year outright, maybe more with careful budgeting. Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. This wasn't how it was supposed to be revealed. It wasn't meant to replace what had been stolen, only to stand alongside it. Still, in that moment, I heard my wife's voice again. "Don't let them take what belongs to Emma." She had known. Somewhere deep down, she had always known. I sat there staring at the numbers, imagining Emma walking across a campus with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Imagining her in classrooms, raising her hand, her mind opening wider with each lecture. That was what this paper represented. Not just money, possibility. Not just balance sheets, freedom. And I knew I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. Soon she would need to know. Not just about the loss, but about this lifeline waiting quietly in the shadows. But another thought came, darker and heavier. If I told her too soon, if I showed her the safety net before she felt the fall, would she ever understand the depth of her father's betrayal? Would she know how close he had come to stealing her dream? Or worse, would she forgive him too easily? Emma's heart was soft. She carried love the way some carry burdens, quietly, without complaint. She might see his theft as a mistake, a lapse, something that could be smoothed over. But I couldn't let that happen. Not this time. So I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer once more. The knowledge steadied me. The account was real, untouched, waiting, like a card I could hold close until the time was right to play it. I would not let her be crushed under the weight of what had happened. But neither would I let Mike escape the truth. For now, this secret was mine. A weapon, a shield, and a promise all in one. I pushed back from the table and stood, the morning light spilling across the floorboards. The house felt different, less like a tomb, more like a place of planning. Every creak of the wood seemed to say, "You're not finished yet." I walked to the window, looked out at the yard where Emma had once played, her laughter filling the summer air. She had run through sprinklers, chased fireflies, built castles of cardboard on that grass. All of it had been fueled by dreams bigger than our small world could hold. And now, with this hidden account, those dreams still had a chance to live. I whispered her name into the quiet as if she could hear me miles away. "Emma," then louder as if speaking to my wife as well. "I've kept the promise." The words steadied me. They drew a line between what had been lost and what could still be saved. The hidden account wasn't just money. It was proof that foresight, sacrifice, and love can outlast even betrayal. And it would be the cornerstone of what came next. The envelope with the hidden account stayed in my jacket pocket, close to my chest, as if proximity alone could protect it. But I knew paper wasn't enough. Numbers on a page weren't enough. If Mike had managed to drain one account with a signature and a smile, he could try again. Not here, not now, but someday. And I couldn't allow it. So I made a call. Not to him. Not to Emma, but to someone who dealt in lines that couldn't be crossed. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a modest brick building downtown. Nothing flashy. No gleaming skyscraper, no glass lobby. Just a plain sign with his name, *David Lindstrom, attorney at law*, etched in black letters. The kind of place you go when you need help with wills and deeds, not when you're trying to impress a corporate board. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet cleaner. A receptionist with kind eyes handed me a clipboard of forms. I filled them out slowly, my handwriting uneven but steady enough. It felt strange writing Emma's name in the spaces marked *beneficiary. Strange and right. When she called me back, I followed her down a short hallway to a door with frosted glass. David rose as I entered. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, glasses perched low on his nose. Not slick, not intimidating, just solid. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending his hand, "please sit down. What can I do for you today?" For a moment, I didn't know where to start. There are conversations that stick in your throat, not because they're complicated, but because admitting them out loud makes them real. Finally, I said, "It's about my granddaughter, her college fund. It was stolen." His brow furrowed slightly, though his voice stayed calm. "Stolen? By whom?" I swallowed hard. "My son." The word hung between us, heavier than any legal brief. David leaned back, folded his hands. He didn't look shocked, only sad in a way that suggested he'd heard stories like this before. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. I told him about the late-night statement, the zeros where there should have been security. I told him about the bank, the authorization, the photos of palm trees and wine glasses. I told him about Emma, her acceptance, her hope, her innocence in all this. By the time I finished, my throat was dry and my hands trembled slightly against the armrests. David was quiet for a while, his gaze fixed on some point beyond me. Finally, he leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, truly, but you did the right thing coming here. You can't stop what's already happened, but you can protect what remains." He slid a legal pad closer, clicked his pen, and began to draw boxes and arrows. "First, that hidden account. It's solely in your name." "Yes." "Good. That's the strongest protection you have. We'll create a trust, a legal structure that takes ownership out of your hands and places it in a document no one can tamper with, not even your son." He drew a line from the box to another. "Emma will be the sole beneficiary. You, as trustee, will manage it until she turns 21. After that, she'll take over directly. That way, no signatures, no co-managers, no loopholes." I watched his pen move across the page, the lines crisp and clean. It looked so simple in ink, but to me it felt like building a wall around her dream, something solid, unbreakable. David paused, glanced up at me. "Do you want your son involved at all? Sometimes parents choose to leave at least a symbolic role." The question twisted something inside me. I thought of Mike as a boy, running through the yard, calling my name. I thought of him now, raising a glass in a resort while his daughter's future slipped away. "No," I said firmly. "Not symbolic, not practical, nothing. He's lost that right." David nodded once as if he'd expected the answer. "Then we'll draft it accordingly." We spent the next hour going through details, documents I'd need, signatures, witnesses. Each step felt like another stone laid in a foundation. Not glamorous work, but the kind that endures. At one point he asked, "Do you want Emma to know right away, or wait until everything is finalized?" I hesitated. "She deserves to know, but not yet, not until she understands what he did. If I protect her without the truth, she might forgive him too easily, and he needs to be seen for what he is." David's gaze softened. "That's a hard line to walk, but I understand." When we finished, I stood, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because there was a plan. Heavier because I knew the confrontation with Mike was only beginning. As we shook hands, David said, "You're doing more than most. A lot of grandparents talk about protecting their grandkids. Few put it in writing. This will stand." His words steadied me. On the drive home, the envelope still pressed against my chest, I felt the faintest flicker of peace. Mike had taken much, but he would take no more. I chose Sunday evening. The day families are supposed to come together, share a meal, trade stories about their week. It seemed fitting that ours would gather, though I knew there'd be no easy conversation, no gentle laughter across the table. I called Emma first. "Sweetheart," I said, "I'd like you to come by Sunday night. There's something important we need to talk about, all of us." She hesitated. She always worried about her father's moods, but finally agreed. "I'll be there, Grandpa." Then I called Mike. When he picked up, his voice was clipped, already wary. "What is it now?" "It's time we sit down," I told him. "You, your wife, Emma, and me, Sunday at the house." He started to protest, but I cut him off. "No more phone calls, no more excuses. If you care about your daughter at all, you'll show up." A long silence stretched on the line before he muttered, "Fine." By the time Sunday came, I'd set the table with 4 plates. No roast, no casserole, just water glasses and silverware. This wasn't a dinner. It was a reckoning. I sat at the head of the table, the envelope with the hidden account tucked beneath my chair. Not to reveal yet, but to remind myself I wasn't empty-handed. I had something solid, something no one could take. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet house until I heard the knock. Emma stepped in first, her face uncertain, eyes darting toward me for reassurance. Behind her came Mike and his wife, both dressed casually, though their posture carried the stiffness of people already on defense. We sat. The air between us felt tight, like a rope pulled too far. I cleared my throat. "I asked you here because we need to talk about the fund, Emma's college fund." Emma blinked. Her fork clattered against her empty plate. "What about it?" I looked at her father. "Why don't you explain?" Mike shifted in his chair, jaw tightening. "I already told you, Dad, we needed the money. It wasn't doing anyone any good sitting in an account. We'll figure out another way for her." Emma's eyes widened. "What money, Dad? What are you talking about?" The silence that followed was thick, unbearable. Then I spoke. "Emma, the account I opened when you were a baby, the one for your college, it's gone. Your father emptied it." She shook her head, confusion flashing to disbelief. "No, that's not possible. Grandpa, you've been saving my whole life. Dad, tell him he's wrong." Mike couldn't meet her eyes. Instead, his wife reached across the table, her tone smooth but brittle. "Emma, honey, you don't understand the pressures of adulthood. Your father and I had needs." Emma's voice cracked like glass. "Needs, that was my future." She turned to me, tears rising. "Grandpa, is this true?" I nodded slowly, the weight of it pressing down on me. "Yes, sweetheart, I've seen the records, it's true." Her chair scraped as she pushed back, covering her mouth with her hand. Her whole body shook as if betrayal itself had form and mass. Mike finally spoke, his voice rising. "Don't act like I'm the villain here. College isn't the only path. She'll survive. We'll find loans. She can work part-time. Kids do it all the time." Emma's eyes flared. "You stole from me. You didn't even ask. You just took it." The room rang with silence after her words. I watched my son, watched the muscles twitch in his jaw, the defensiveness in his posture. But I also saw something else, fear, not of me, not even of Emma's anger, but of exposure, of being stripped bare in front of the very people he thought he could manipulate. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "Mike, this ends now. You've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Emma deserves the truth, and she has it now. What she does with it, that's hers to decide. But you will not control her future any longer." His wife scoffed. "You can't just cut us out, we're her parents." I met her gaze steady. "You forfeited that privilege the moment you treated her life like spending money." Emma sank back into her chair, tears streaking her face, but her eyes were steady now. She looked at me, not her father. "Grandpa, what do we do?" The question pierced me, because it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust, about who she could count on when the people meant to protect her had turned away. I reached under the chair, felt the envelope brush my fingertips. Not yet, I thought. Not tonight. Tonight was about the truth. The rest would come in time. I placed my hand over hers instead. "We move forward, Emma, together, and I promise you your future is safe." Across the table, Mike's face darkened, but for once he had no words. After they left, the house felt like it was holding its breath. The plates still sat untouched on the table, 4 circles of porcelain that had never seen food, only accusations and silence. I gathered them slowly, one by one, the clink of glass and silverware sounding louder than it should. Emma hadn't spoken much after the meeting ended. Her tears had dried, but her eyes carried the hollow look of someone who'd just seen the ground give way beneath her feet. She'd hugged me tight at the door, whispering, "Thank you," before walking out into the night. Now, hours later, the phone buzzed. Her name lit the screen. "Grandpa." Her voice was quiet, strained. "I'm here, sweetheart." There was a pause, and I could picture her sitting on the edge of her bed, the acceptance papers still spread across her desk, the dreams she'd cherished now tangled in doubt. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "He's my dad, but after tonight, I don't even know who he is anymore." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The rain had returned, tapping gently at the windows like a metronome keeping time with her words. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," I told her softly. "But you do have to decide who you want to be in this moment. Not for him, for you." She sniffed, then let out a shaky laugh. "That sounds like something Grandma would have said." I smiled faintly. She'd probably say it louder and with more fire. That drew a small laugh from her, but it faded quickly. "I keep thinking about all the times he told me he was proud of me. Was it real, or was he just saying words?" I thought of Mike as a young father, holding Emma on his shoulders at the county fair, pointing out the Ferris wheel, her arms spread wide like wings. There had been love in his eyes then, But love without responsibility is like a boat without an anchor, drifting, dangerous. Maybe both. I said carefully. He loves you, Emma, I believe that, but love that takes more than it gives, it isn't the kind you can lean on. Silence stretched again, then her voice steadier this time. I don't want to hate him, but I can't just pretend it didn't happen. If I forgive him right now, it'll be like saying what he did was okay. And it's not. Her words carried a clarity that surprised me, though I realized it had always been in her. The steadiness her grandmother saw. The resilience forged not from ease but from disappointment. You don't have to hate him, I said, and you don't have to forgive him yet either. You can choose distance. You can choose yourself. I heard the creak of her bed as she shifted. When I was little, I used to think he was a superhero, she admitted. The one who'd always protect me. Tonight I realized maybe he's just a man who makes really bad choices. Her voice caught, but she didn't cry this time. Instead, she sounded older, as though the night itself had pushed her forward. Grandpa, she said, I want to go to college. I want to study and learn and make something of myself. And I want to do it without being afraid he'll take it from me again. My hand tightened around the phone. This was the moment my wife had asked me to prepare her for. The moment Emma chose not just who she was, but who she refused to be. You will, I told her firmly. No matter what he's done, you will, I promise. She let out a long breath, the kind that sounds like a burden slipping just slightly off the shoulders. I think I need space from him, she said. I'll still be his daughter, but I don't have to be his victim. Her words lit something in me. Pride, yes, but also relief. She wasn't broken. She was bending the way strong trees do in storms. We spoke a little longer about classes she wanted to take, about the dorms she'd seen in the brochure. Her voice lifted as she spoke of them, her dream returning piece by piece. By the time we said goodnight, there was steel beneath the softness in her tone. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet, staring at the envelope still tucked in my drawer. Soon I would show her. Soon she would know her future was still secure. But tonight had been about her choice, not mine, and she had chosen well. She had chosen not to let betrayal define her. She had chosen herself. Trouble has a way of leaking out. No matter how tightly you try to seal it, no matter how carefully you tuck it behind closed doors, the truth finds cracks. And when it does, it spreads. With Mike, it began with whispers. Neighbors noticed he and his wife returned from their trip with tans and new clothes but avoided eye contact at the grocery store. One of them asked casually about their vacation, and his answer came too quick, too rehearsed. The kind of answer that smells of guilt. Then came the church potluck. A simple Sunday gathering, long tables filled with casseroles and pies, the kind of event where families present their best selves. But when Emma arrived without her parents, carrying her dish alone, questions started. Where was Mike? Why wasn't he with her? She didn't answer at first. But when pressed, she said just enough. Things are complicated right now, and left it at that. Still, in small towns and close communities, complicated is a seed. People water it with speculation until it grows into something much larger. The real crack came online. Social media, the very stage where Mike had flaunted his island getaway, became the place where his image began to unravel. One of Emma's friends, anger simmering on her behalf, posted, "Imagine stealing your kid's college money to sip cocktails on the beach. Some people don't deserve to be parents." She didn't use names, but it didn't take long for the dots to connect. The photos from the trip were public. The timing was clear, and whispers became shouts. Comments multiplied, people asking questions, others supplying answers. Screenshots were shared, bank rumors repeated, each story weaving into a tapestry of disgrace. By the end of the week, Mike could no longer hide behind silence. His boss called him in for a discussion. Financial impropriety, even in one's personal life, casts a long shadow in professional circles. Trust is currency, and his was devaluing by the day. He came out of that meeting pale and tight-lipped, and word spread quickly that he was on probation, though everyone knew what that meant. In offices like his, probation was just a prelude to dismissal. At the grocery store, the cashier who once chatted warmly now gave curt nods. At the diner, conversations paused when he walked in, eyes shifting, forks clinking against plates a little too loudly. His wife, once proud to post every outing, went quiet online. Her last photo was of that beach dinner, frozen in time like a cruel monument. I watched it unfold quietly. Not with glee. There is no joy in seeing your child unravel, even when they have brought it on themselves, but with a certain grim clarity. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It had seeped into the world, and the world had turned its gaze on him. Emma, for her part, stayed quiet. She went to school, filled out her forms, leaned on me when the weight of whispers grew too heavy, but she didn't add to the fire. Her silence, I realized, spoke louder than any accusation could. One evening she came to my house after practice, dropping her backpack by the door. Her face was weary, but her eyes were steady. "Grandpa," she said, "people are talking. I didn't tell them everything, just that things weren't right, but now it feels like everybody knows. I don't want to be the girl whose dad stole from her." I pulled out a chair for her and she sat, folding her arms on the table the way she used to when she was small. "You're not defined by what he did," I told her gently. "They'll talk. Let them. Over time, the truth settles. And when it does, it won't be about what he took, it'll be about what you did despite it." She looked at me, her eyes glistening. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," I said. "Your grandmother always believed a person's legacy isn't written in what's stolen from them. It's written in how they rise after." Meanwhile, Mike avoided me. No calls, no visits. When we crossed paths at the gas station one morning, he glanced my way, his face drawn, and quickly turned his back. The swagger was gone, replaced by something smaller, tighter, like a man trying to disappear into himself. I should have felt vindicated. But instead, I felt the deep ache of watching my own blood bear the consequences of his choices. Still, choices have weight, and for once he was the one carrying it. That night, as Emma slept soundly in the guest room, her books spread across the nightstand, her sneakers kicked carelessly by the door, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope again. The numbers were unchanged, the safety net still intact. The storm around Mike was growing, yes, but Emma's future was steady, quietly waiting. And for the first time, I understood. Sometimes unraveling isn't the end. Sometimes it's the only way the truth can breathe. The courthouse was a squat, unremarkable building, the kind you pass without noticing unless you have business inside. I had business inside, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The trust papers were ready. David had called me earlier in the week, his voice steady but carrying a certain weight. "Mr. Hayes, it's time to sign. Once we do this, there's no going back." That was exactly what I wanted, no going back. The security guard at the entrance waved me through with the courtesy reserved for older men who walk with purpose. Inside, the floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood polish. David met me just outside his office door, his leather briefcase in hand. He wore the same navy suit as before, his tie slightly loosened. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, more ready than I had ever been. In his office, the documents were spread across the table, thick with signatures, legal jargon, and numbers. I sat down slowly, pulling my glasses from my pocket, and began to read line by line. Years of working construction had taught me never to sign until you understood every nail, every joint, every beam. This was no different. David waited patiently as I worked through the pages. When I reached the section titled Irrevocable Trust for Educational Purposes, I paused. The words struck with a kind of finality. It was as though I could hear my wife's voice telling me this was the safeguard she'd always wanted. "Mr. Hayes," David said gently, "this trust means Emma's education funds will be untouchable, solely for her use. You're trustee until she reaches 21. At that point, she gains full control." "And Mike?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "He has no access, no legal standing, no loopholes." David's tone was firm, leaving no space for doubt. "Even if he tries, the law is on your side." For the first time in months, I felt something like relief ease across my shoulders. Not joy, not victory, just relief, the kind that comes when you've finally laid a burden down. I signed my name slowly, the pen scratching against the paper. Each signature was more than ink. It was a line drawn between Emma's future and her father's mistakes. When I set the pen down, David gathered the pages neatly, sliding them into a folder with practiced precision. "It's done," he said. Those two words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. "It's done." The shift had happened, quiet but absolute. On the drive home, I thought about Mike, about the way his face had darkened during the family meeting, about the whispers that now followed him wherever he went. and about the boy he had once been, running barefoot through the backyard, shouting for me to watch him climb higher, jump farther. I gripped the wheel tighter. There was still love there, love that no paper could erase. But love doesn't mean blind trust. Love doesn't mean letting harm repeat itself. Sometimes, love means building fences to protect the ones who need it most. Emma came by that evening, dropping her backpack with the casual thud that always made the house feel more alive. She sat at the kitchen table, brushing her hair back, eyes curious. "You've been busy," she said softly, sensing the weight in me. I nodded. "I had to make sure of something, that your path stays clear, that what was taken can never be taken again." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I slid the folder across the table. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the lines, her lips moving as she read. When she reached her name, beneficiary, Emma Hayes, she looked up at me, eyes wide. "Grandpa, it's mine." "It's yours," I said. "Not because it fell into your lap, but because it was built from years of sacrifice, and now it's locked where no one can touch it but you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand finding mine. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to," I said. "Just live it. Live the dream your grandmother and I saved for. That's thanks enough." For a long time we sat there in silence, her hand warm over mine, the folder between us like a bridge. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. I thought of the years behind me, of the mistakes and the sacrifices, of promises made at a bedside and kept at a courthouse. The shift had happened, not loudly, not with anger or spectacle, but in ink, in law, in quiet resolve. Emma's future was no longer a hope. It was a certainty. It didn't take long for the papers to reach him. Bad news always travels faster than good, and when it involves money, it sprints. 3 nights after Emma signed her scholarship forms with renewed confidence, the knock came, hard, impatient, the kind of knock that doesn't wait to be invited. I opened the door to find Mike standing there, his face flushed, his jaw tight. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You went to a lawyer." I didn't answer right away. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. If this storm was going to hit, I'd rather it be inside 4 walls than out on the porch where neighbors could watch. He paced the living room like a caged animal. His wife hadn't come with him. Maybe even she knew this battle wasn't hers to fight. Emma wasn't home either, I'd made sure of that. This was between a father and his son. "You cut me out," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You locked me out of her future like I'm some stranger. I'm her father." I watched him, letting the words hang in the air. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "You stopped being her father the moment you chose a vacation over her education." He froze mid-stride, turned on me. "You think one mistake defines me. You think you're better than me just because you saved a little money." "A little," I said, my chest tightening. "I worked for decades. I missed holidays, skipped dinners, carried bricks on my back until my bones ached. I built that fund penny by penny, and you drained it in one swipe of a card." His face twisted, shame flashing just long enough to look like pain before pride buried it. "You don't understand what it's like to carry everything, to have a wife, a house, expectations. You never—" "Stop," I cut him off. "Don't stand there and pretend you carried more than I did. I carried you for years. I carried your rent, your bills, your failures. And when it came time for you to carry your daughter, you dropped her." The room was silent except for the tick of the old clock on the mantel. I could see his hands shaking, could see the war between anger and guilt written across his face, but he chose anger. "You poisoned her against me," he said. "You made me look like the villain." I stepped closer, my voice dropping. "You don't need me to make you look like anything. You did that all by yourself." For a moment he seemed smaller. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted like a boy caught in a lie. And I almost saw the child in him again, the boy who once wanted me to clap at his baseball games, who used to crawl into my lap when thunder scared him. But that boy was long gone. This man had made choices the boy never could have imagined. He straightened, defiance hardening his voice. "I'll fight this. I'll go to court if I have to. She's my daughter, and you can't just take her away from me." I met his stare steady. "No court in this country will give you access to money you've already proven you'll steal. And no paper in the world can make Emma trust you again. You didn't just lose her fund, Mike, you lost her." His mouth opened, then closed. Words failed him. For the first time in this long, painful unraveling, he had nothing left to argue. He turned toward the door, muttering, "You'll regret this." I let the words pass without answer. Threats from a drowning man are only splashes, they make noise but don't change the tide. At the door he stopped, his hand resting on the knob. For a moment I thought he might turn back, say something softer, something like the son I once knew. But he didn't. He slammed the door behind him and the house shook in his absence. I stood alone in the quiet, my hands trembling not from fear but from the enormity of it all. It had been building for months, maybe years, and now it had broken. The final confrontation was over, though the ripples would last a long time. Emma would still carry the sting of betrayal. I would still carry the sorrow of watching my son fall so far, but the line was drawn. Her future was safe, and I had kept the promise I made to her grandmother on that quiet, rain-soaked night so long ago. The summer passed slowly, like the turning of pages in a book I wasn't quite ready to finish. The days grew longer, the evenings stretched with the hum of cicadas, and all the while Emma prepared for what came next. College brochures cluttered the kitchen table. Her acceptance letter, once a fragile hope, was now pinned proudly to the fridge with a magnet shaped like an apple. Every time I saw it, my chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The trust papers were signed, sealed, and filed away. The hidden account was no longer hidden. It was Emma's, legally and irrevocably. What had once been a secret safeguard was now a lifeline, strong enough to carry her toward the future she deserved. One afternoon in late August, we drove together to campus. The truck bed was loaded with boxes, books, bedding, a kettle she swore she'd need for late-night tea. She sat beside me in the cab, humming softly along with the radio, her excitement bubbling beneath the surface like a pot about to boil over. "You know," she said suddenly, glancing at me, "I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you." I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You'd have found a way, you're stronger than you think." She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have had the peace. I wouldn't have known I was safe. That's because of you, Grandpa." Her words settled deep, like stones dropped into water, rippling outward. When we arrived, the campus was alive with movement. Students lugging boxes, parents giving last-minute advice, volunteers handing out maps and welcome packets. It was a sea of beginnings. We carried her things up 3 flights of stairs, each trip lighter than the last, though my back protested all the same. Her dorm room was small, just enough for a bed, a desk, and a dresser. But when she arranged her books, spread her quilt, and pinned photos of family and friends to the corkboard, it began to look like something more. It began to look like hers. I stood in the doorway watching her bustle about. For a moment she was that little girl again, arranging dolls in a row, asking if they looked just right. And just as I had then, I nodded. "Looks perfect." Later we walked the campus together. She showed me the library, the fountain at the center of the quad, the hall where her first classes would be held. Her voice carried both excitement and nerves, but mostly pride. This was hers. No one could take it away now. At the fountain she paused, watching the water arc and fall, sunlight dancing on its surface. "Grandma would have loved this place," she said softly. I swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in my eyes. "She would have. And she'd be proud of you, Emma, more than you can imagine." She slipped her arm through mine and we stood there together, letting the moment settle like a blessing. The drive home was quieter. The truck felt emptier without her beside me, but it wasn't the emptiness of loss. It was the emptiness of change, the kind that means something new has begun. When I pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me with its familiar creaks and sighs. It felt different now, not lonely, just quieter, as though it too was waiting for the next chapter. I walked into the bedroom where my wife's photo still stood, framed in silver. I set my hand against the dresser, leaned close and whispered, "She made it, she's safe." The silence in the room felt full, as though her presence still lingered, wrapping around me like a soft shawl. I closed my eyes and let that comfort wash over me. Weeks passed and Emma settled into her new life. She called often, sometimes to share small victories, sometimes just to hear a familiar voice. Her laughter over the phone carried differently now. It wasn't the laughter of a child. It was the laughter of a young woman standing firmly on her own path. Mike didn't call, not once. I heard bits and pieces. His job had slipped through his fingers, his circle of friends had shrunk. He was adrift, as I had feared he might be. But I no longer carried the burden of saving him. That was his road to walk. My road was Emma. My road was the promise I had made, kept to the very end. One crisp evening in September, I sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the trees. The air was cool, the first hints of autumn threading through the leaves. I sipped my coffee and listened to the world quiet itself. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of what had been lost. I felt the strength of what remained. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who share your heart. And Emma, she was my heart. She was my wife's dream carried forward, my own sacrifice made real. She was proof that love, when tended carefully, could survive betrayal. The future was hers now, but in a way it was mine too, because in securing her tomorrow I had found peace for my own today. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me, and whispered into the quiet night, "It's done, she's free." And for the first time in years I believed it. Dear friends, thank you for staying with me through this story, through the storm of betrayal, the weight of sacrifice, and the triumph of love that endures. Stories like this aren't just about one family. They're about all of us. They remind us that even in the hardest moments we have choices: to protect, to forgive, to stand firm for the ones who need us most. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that family, at its best, is built on love and sacrifice, not on convenience or gain. From my family to yours, I wish you health, peace, and the kind of love that endures through every trial. May your homes be filled with warmth, your days with laughter, and your nights with rest. Take care of yourselves and each other.